But it's also a heavy responsibility, because it's not kind of this thing that you get to do. It's not a gift you get to do whatever you want with. It's a gift that actually, in order for you to celebrate it and lift it up and say, yes, for the desolate woman now has more children than the woman who has a husband, you have to be able to say, I have more children than if I were to have gotten married. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful statement, and I also think it's really important to put singleness in that context of having children, and having Paul, who's a single man, use family language all the time, calling, people referring to him as sort of a spiritual father, him continuously calling Timothy his son. He was not sort of hedging around this question of reproduction and having children. He was very specific. He knew who his children were, he knew who their children were, and he thought about them like a father would. And so all of that, I think, is a really important context to that.
It seems like he is thinking, like when he says the crisis, it seems like he's talking into just the responsibility that would be, like you said, how hard it would be for a woman to make dinner for 5 kids.
Yes.
That day,
Yes.
Responsibility.
Yes. And in the way that you had these larger families in the first century that had very, very complicated, domestic lives that were were very risky in some ways. They had to make sure they had enough food, much more than today. And so you had that going on. And so to have a single person to go into a family's home who has all that taken care of, has make sure that you're fed and you have a place to sleep, the amount of actual hours you could spend in ministry compared to what would happen if you actually got married and started having your own family and then had to go through 10 or 20 years of building up your own household was so stark, so huge. And I think that, again, that's kind of the calculation Paul's making here. If it takes 10 or 20 years to raise a family and establish a household, and that you almost have to exclusively focus on those very physical tasks during that whole season, and then you contrast that with the idea of staying unmarried, maybe even while you're engaged, not going through with it, living in community with other families that have already established those things. It's a real big contrast. And I think that's the calculation we have to sort of consider today. And I think it's really in the same way we have to think about it in those terms. But if you could think about a way of being married and ministering and being reproductive spiritually while you're also being reproductive physically, that's a sort of also kind of best of both worlds potential scenario, and it just almost would depend on the person at that point, as opposed to the circumstances, where I think in their day they could say a lot more general things about the circumstances. Go ahead, Kurt.
In our culture today, we're talking about culture now, and use now later at the end, it's like, would it be, to have kids now as opposed to then, it would just be so much more.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a huge contrast, very different. And then let's look at this third passage. Now, this is the real place where Jesus is talking about the level of sort of the covenant of marriage. He draws a line here that really was different than the line in the Torah, where Moses made a concession to the Israelites and told them, if you want to get divorced, you can do it. You have to write a certificate and make sure that your former wife is taken care of and can actually move on with her life. So you have to provide that for her, but you can then get divorced. Jesus turns around and slams the door in the face of that exception and says that was never God's intention. That was a concession because he knew your hearts were hard. God does not want anyone to ever get divorced. And anyone who does get divorced or marries a woman who is divorced has committed adultery. It's the strongest part of the whole Bible. And the disciples reacted very, very anti this idea and said, this does not make sense. And and therefore everyone should be single. And basically Jesus' reaction to that was, well, that's not such a bad thing. He says, there's different kinds of people who stay single. Some people can't get married because they physically can't reproduce. Some people became eunuchs by others. And some people choose not to marry for the kingdom. And he says, let anyone accept this who can. So in sort of the face of Paul's statements, this is really consistent with Jesus' own theology in this area. He made just as strong a statement as Paul ever did about the value of singleness. So I don't know if anything there stands out to you guys, but that's a very strong passage.
Like it's almost a special deal if you can be single in certain ways.
Yeah.
That's a special call.
Yeah.
Not you're burdened, it's bad.
And there's the word here, he says some choose, most translations say some have renounced marriage, or they'll say, and there's other parts, but down in 1 Timothy it says about the widow, if she decides that she's going to stay single and then she decides not to stay single, she will be guilty of breaking her previous pledge. There was a concept in the early church, very strong, of this idea of taking a vow of singleness. And this is different than just being single, like, circumstantially. There was a decision you made to actually make a pledge, get in front of the entire community that you were part of, the church of that city, and say, I have made a decision that I want to remain single. And it's really important to make that public so that people aren't pursuing you, and so that you get to be completely devoted to the Lord without any distractions, without being distracted without people saying, oh honey, we'll find somebody for you. Like, put to rest all of the matchmaking, so you say, I don't want to have anything to do with those distractions. I want to be single. I believe God's called me to be single, and I have made a vow before the Lord to remain single for the rest of my life. And in all throughout church history, that you have whatever, like convents and monasteries where you have nuns and monks in the Catholic Church, and other church expressions where you have people that have made this vow and that are living in community together. So this should be an option, and this should be considered, I think. I mean, how it's done can be done. You don't have to go to a monastery. You can live in community with other married families, but I think the fact is there is such a thing as making a vow and deciding that this is a calling and sticking with the calling. And I think what's odd to me is that this is sort of relegated to like one branch of the church, as opposed to this just being a part of a community's experience. You have different kinds of people in a community. You have married people, you have children, you have singles who are unmarried, and you have people who have made a vow to remain single. I don't know if you guys have questions or thoughts about that, but that was also an option, and I think has been really common until recently in more evangelical communities.
So it's almost like pushing these cultures back together versus the separate.
Right. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I just think it's really important too because of the purpose of singleness, which is to take advantage of all of the resources that are available, and the lack of distractions. That's such a great thing. But if you don't take a vow, or you don't at least make clear, this period of time I'm not interested in finding a mate, I want to serve the Lord, there's always going to be a tension in the community about they want to be married, they just aren't. That's the assumption that we kind of place onto people. And if that's not true of then the community needs to allow for that to be communicated, and for that to stop the natural thing that happens, where people are hoping that you get married or helping you try to find someone or whatever.
One of the challenges we're running into is this tension of the married people see the single people's freedom and are envious of it.
Yeah.
Vice versa, the single people see the married people and they're envious of it. And I think that's maybe why we have these split communities.
Yes.
So I don't know if that helps. I don't know. I'm just trying to how do you merge these back together? Not everyone going, that looks better than
The grass is always green. Yeah. Yeah, and that's this statement that Paul makes about, that there's different gifts. He says, yet each person has a special gift from God of one kind or another. It's really important to think about the state that you're in as a gift. And this is not, I think, just for people that are kind of single for life. This is really about the fact that every season of your life has a purpose, and every season of your life comes with a bunch of different gifts. And one of the gifts is, if you're married, you have this gift of a spouse, and if you're single, you have this gift of this undistracted life. And as opposed to like what you're describing, Justin, I think it's actually really important for both singles and married people to try their best to accentuate the difference between the married and the single life. So married people should actually work hard to try to help single people to live a more undistracted life, a more radically different life than their life, to take full advantage of the gift because it's better for the kingdom. The bigger question is both the married family and the single person should ask, what is best for the kingdom? And so what's best for the kingdom is for each person to fully enter into the season and the gifts that God's given them. In the same way that somebody with the gift of teaching and somebody with the gift of mercy shouldn't say, I need to reduce your gift of mercy and you need to reduce my gift of teaching so that we both are less effective and less jealous. That's not the way to go. So that's kind of what we're doing in the church when we make this happen. We need to say, how do I help you be a better single person? And actually take advantage more of the opportunities that a single person has. And for a married couple, a single person could say, hey, Kay, there are awesome things about your life as a married, and I want to make sure that you guys have a great relationship. If that means take off for a weekend, and I want to help you do that. Don't feel jealous of that. Say, that's awesome. You guys enjoy the gift God's given you. It's blessing the kingdom. We need you guys to be really united. We need you to be one. We're going to celebrate that, and we're going to encourage that. And then the married family should go and say, how can we bless the single person and make sure that all of the singles in our community are really enjoying all the benefits that come with being single. That's just that kind of kingdom mindset. I think it allows us to have that perspective. So what else do you guys, any other observations that really stand out to you guys in these passages?
One of the things, I think about my own kids, and my oldest son is 6, right? What I don't want to tell him, unless he has a special vow of singleness, is when he turns 13, to wait until he's 29 to get married.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm setting him up to fail.
Yeah.
And I feel like our culture has set men and women up to just be miserable and fail. And I'm wondering, and I don't have answers to this, but I want to change that. Because it's clear here that sex is an issue, right?
Yes.
We're stupid to say it's not.
Yes.
It's an issue then, it's an issue now.
Yeah.
I've just been thinking a lot about that our culture is screwed up in how we're doing it.
Yeah, so if sort of the principle that Paul is actually articulating here is that the greater the persecution, the more people should stay single, and the less persecution, the more marriage, and then the more sexual immorality, the more marriage. What kind of culture do we live in? Like what then does that, if those are the principles he's laying out in 1 Corinthians 7, which is what I see here, should there be more or less singleness in the church compared to like in the early church or other times in history?
Way less.
Yeah, so yeah, the indication to me is there should be a lot less singleness. The fact, if imagining the how difficult it is in our culture with the internet, and with all the different sexual temptations, where in Corinth you had to get up, go to the temple, like sign in, pay money, do all these things but in front of the whole community and go sleep with a temple prostitute. It was like a really big deal, and everybody knew you were doing it, and it's like really public. Like, so to screw up, people knew, like, oh, this guy's struggling with sexual morality, Their houses were much smaller, their communities were much tighter, privacy was much lower in their day. So